the Australian Sangha Association. So we'll start with acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Australian Sangha Association recognises the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live, work and care. We pay our respects to elders past and present, senior knowledge holders, cultural heritage, spiritual connection to earth, sea and sky, and to truth-telling. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. So a note on this evening's proceedings. So we'll first hear from our invited speakers and then address some of the questions that have arisen within the Buddhist community. And if there is a time subsequently for people to unmute and ask questions, we'll of course include that. Or if you don't wish to unmute and speak yourself, you can put it in the chat, but keep in mind that we've got a pretty full program. So we have 1.5 hours for this forum. And so firstly, I would like to then introduce our presenters, Noel Pearson, Dr. Shireen Morris and Bhante Sujato. Firstly, it's a great honour that Noel Pearson, thank you very much, accepted the Australian Sangha Association's invitation to speak at this forum. We're truly thankful. Noel Pearson comes from the Gugu Yimdir community of Hope Vale on southeastern Cape York Peninsula. Noel has provided sustained driving force in the discourse on Indigenous rights in our country for more than 30 years. He's well known for his contributions to achieving Indigenous land rights. Noel is the co-founder of Cape York Land Council and negotiated with the Keating government to establish the Native Title Act 1993 after the Mabo High Court decision finally rejected the fiction of terra nullius. After seeing socioeconomic problems that were not present in his childhood accumulate, Noel has focused on pioneering, empowering and holistic approaches to welfare reform and transforming educational outcomes for disadvantaged students. Noel is the founder of Cape York Partnership and Good to Great Schools Australia and has co-founded other organisations also dedicated to ameliorating entrenched disadvantage of the bottom million. As well as seeking behavioural change in families and communities, Noel has long advocated for structural reforms to empower Indigenous people. He served as a member of the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians and the Referendum Council. Noel is currently a member of the First Nations Referendum Working Group and continues to advocate for structural reforms to empower Indigenous people. So as we can hear, he's very busy. We are so delighted that you've been able to join us this evening. We are delighted as well to welcome Dr. Shireen Morris to join this conversation. Shireen is a constitutional lawyer, senior lecturer and director of the Radical Centre Reform Lab at Macquarie University Law School. She has spent the past 12 years working with Indigenous leaders like Noel Pearson and working with Cape York Institute, devising and advocating the concept of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous voice, the subject of her 2017 PhD thesis. Since 2020, Shireen has been particularly focused on building multicultural and multi-faith support for the voice. Shireen publishes widely in academia and mainstream media and often commentates on TV and radio. Her books include The Statements from the Soul, the moral case for the Uluru Statement from the Heart, published earlier this year, for which Bhante Sujato contributed a chapter presenting a Buddhist perspective. Bhante Sujato is a highly respected Buddhist teacher and scholar, particularly known for establishing Sutta Central as a repository of early Buddhist texts, making suttas available in accessible translations. Last year, Bhante Sujato formally signed the Uluru Statement from the Heart. on behalf of the Australian Sangha Association and contributed a Buddhist perspective in the multi-faith book, Statements from the Heart, as mentioned earlier, published by the Radical Centre Reform Lab at Macquarie University Law School, of which Shireen is the director. So welcome to you all.
Thank you.
The Australian Sangha Association supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and this year has made the voice a priority area of action. While as monastics we do not engage in politics, it is our moral responsibility to ensure all voices are heard equally and with respect. We represent culturally and linguistically diverse communities from all Buddhist traditions. At the ASA annual conference in Canberra in May, we heard from Elder Uncle Kenny Bedford presenting on the Yes campaign. Subsequently, we collaborated with the Federation of Australian Buddhist Councils, which represents all the state Buddhist councils representing all the institutions, Buddhist institutions, temples, monasteries, nunneries, and so forth, to create an action plan, including video messages from Buddhist leaders from diverse cultural communities, a forum on the voice in Sydney next month to produce a joint Buddhist statement, and through the Together Yes campaign, hosting kitchen table discussions in Perth, hosted by Sakyadisha Australia, representing Buddhist women's voices. Alongside other faith traditions, we are unanimous in supporting the voice to Parliament and look forward to an Australia, where we walk together, walk forward stronger for sharing the richness of our diverse knowledge systems. So now I'd like to ask Shireen to talk from the perspective of a constitutional lawyer and to speak to her multicultural, multi-faith work, providing us with a historical context. Thanks, Shireen.
Thank you so much for that. And thanks so much for the invitation to be here tonight. It's wonderful to talk to you all. I too pay respects to the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people, where I'm calling in from. So look, I started working on this 12 years ago in 2011 as a law student at Monash University, when I went up and did this Aurora internship program where you get to go off on your uni holidays and volunteer at native title bodies or other Indigenous organisations. And I was lucky enough to go up to Cape York Institute in Cairns, where I met Noel. And this was way back in 2011. So Noel must have been impressed with something I did, because he unexpectedly offered me a job working on Indigenous constitutional recognition. And I went on to work for the Institute for 7 years on this topic, and it's been a 12-year-long collaboration with Noel. So the first thing I learned from the Indigenous people and leaders up in Cape York was the history. The fact that in the 1800s, when the representatives of the British colonies spent a decade negotiating with each other how they were going to unite to create this new nation, Australia, not one single Indigenous representative was included in those discussions, even though they'd lived here for 65,000 years or more. And so as a result, the constitutional compact that they negotiated, which came into force in 1901, contained clauses explicitly excluding Indigenous people. And constitutional lawyers talk about the Constitution as a power-sharing compact, because really it's all about power. It distributes legal and political power in this country, and it sets in place rules and principles and processes that regulate and constrain the use of, the exercise of power by Australian governments. So it's a power-sharing compact. But for Indigenous people, the Constitution created a position of perpetual powerlessness. The Uluru Statement from the Heart talks about the torment of powerlessness that Indigenous people have experienced in Australian history. And I think the source of that powerlessness really is the Constitution. So it set up this really top-down power relationship with Indigenous people. And Noel always used to talk about the elephant and the mouse dynamic that characterises Indigenous affairs, because you've got this 3% mouse, the 3% Indigenous population in this country, trying to be heard and trying to assert their rights in a situation where they've got to convince the mighty 97% elephant. You know, in our democratic system, the non-Indigenous majority is 97% and is all powerful. So that's this top-down power dynamic established by the Constitution. Now, as a result of this position of powerlessness, the Constitution has presided over a lot of unfair and discriminatory laws and policies about Indigenous people. Laws denying Indigenous people the vote in some jurisdictions right up until the 60s. And indeed, proper formal equality wasn't achieved until something like 1983, because up until then, it wasn't even compulsory for Indigenous people to vote. Policies denying equal wages for their hard work, or sometimes non-payment of wages, controlling where they could live, who they could marry, sometimes banning their languages from being spoken, and of course, denying their property rights. And even though today most of that harsh discrimination is in the past, that top-down power dynamic still continues. You know, politicians and bureaucrats in Canberra make well-intentioned policies and spend a lot of money trying to alleviate Indigenous disadvantage, but they often misinterpret the needs and priorities of Indigenous communities. And so these well-intentioned efforts fail. And if you were looking at the media in the last couple of weeks, you would have seen the Productivity Commission's report into the Closing the Gap review, the review into the Closing the Gap process. And the Productivity Commission said what Indigenous people have been saying for years, which is closing the gap is failing. Why? Because governments do not know how to listen to Indigenous communities. You know, they do not partner with Indigenous communities. Everything is top down. So because of this history and because of this top-down power dynamic, Indigenous advocates have for decades and decades and decades been calling for a stronger voice when government makes laws and policies about them. Way back since, 1930s, William Cooper petitioned the British King asking for a voice in Parliament. In the 60s, the Yolngu Bark petitions asked for better consultation when government makes decisions about them and their land. 1988, the Barunga Statement, the Yolngu people gave to Bob Hawke, who was Prime Minister at that time. It asked for a treaty and a national Indigenous body to give them a voice, right? Now, subsequently, ATSIC was legislated into existence, but when problems arose and the politics changed, it was chucked out because it wasn't underpinned by any constitutional guarantee. So this is why the constitutional enshrinement of a voice is so important. So in 2017, that long history of Indigenous advocacy culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was the first time ever that a national Indigenous consensus was achieved on how they wanted to be constitutionally recognised. And they asked for one constitutional reform, a constitutionally guaranteed voice in laws and policies made about them. Not a veto, just an advisory voice. And it was an extraordinary consensus because there were 250 Indigenous delegates chosen by their Indigenous peers around the country through the regional dialogues, 12, 13 dialogues that were held. Of those 250 Indigenous delegates, only 7 dissented, right? The now Senator Lydia Thorpe was among those 7 dissenters. Now, 250 minus 7 dissenters is something like a 97% strong consensus. That is extraordinary when you think about the diversity of Indigenous Australia. The north-south differences, the cultural, linguistic differences, urban, regional, remote, personality, political differences, yet they achieved that strong of a consensus. And since then, successive polls show that over 80% of Indigenous Australians want a constitutionally guaranteed voice in their affairs. I think, you know, that's extraordinary. It's very unrealistic to expect 100% consensus. I'm Indian, Fijian Indian background. Let me tell you, you would never get 97, 80% consensus in the Indian community on anything, let alone on something as complicated as constitutional reform, right? So it deserves to be respected. Now, over the last 2 years, I've been working with multi-faith and multicultural communities to help build support in multicultural Australia for this proposed change. You would have seen last year the major peak religious organisations of Australia, and your organisation was one, came together and stood proudly behind a yes vote in this upcoming referendum. And this great event was held at Barangaroo in Sydney, and Rachel Perkins spoke. Out of that has grown a sort of growing multicultural movement behind this. And if you look at the website multiculturalforvoice.org, you'll see that well over 150 multicultural community organisations have signed up in support. I think there's enormous goodwill in multicultural Australia for this cause. And I think it's because many of us, migrants and descendants of migrants, we come from countries where we too maybe have experienced discrimination. You know, some of those countries have colonial histories of their own. So there is this sense of real empathy for what Indigenous people are asking for here. And in my experience, when communities understand the history that I've gone through, and the history of exclusion, real exclusion and real injustice that Indigenous people have experienced, the generosity, the profound generosity of the Uluru Statement comes into real focus. Because what they are asking for, yes, it's profound. It has the capacity, if it succeeds, to deliver real practical change, practical results over time in Indigenous communities. But in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the history, it is a modest request. You know, it is, given what they have been through, they are coming to us with hands outstretched and saying, we want in, even though you've excluded us in the past, we want in to Australia. We want to be part of your constitution permanently. And all we're asking for is an advisory voice, you know, in laws and policies made about Indigenous affairs. To me, it's an extraordinary invitation, and we need to do everything we can to get it over the line. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shireen, for reminding us too of the historical context in which this conversation sits. It reminds me that when I ordained, I was working at Nurrugili and as an academic coordinator for Nurrugili, the Indigenous unit at New South Wales Uni. And my ordaining abbot, when I put the question, I was researching shared values of Buddhists, particularly in my tradition, the Tibetan tradition, and Indigenous traditions, which I'm still passionate about, because he said, to continue on with this research, I thought, I'm leaving the academia, I don't need this. And he was, no, think of the good for humanity. So I think this is part of the conversation that we have to have. I myself are here on Whadjuk Noongar Nation, so in Perth, and very difficult, sad issues in the state in relation to the rollback of cultural heritage laws, just, you know, currently, and the great tragedy of the Juukan Gorge. And it seems like we've got a long way to go in this state to recognise our equality as humans sharing this country. So now it's a great honour to invite our special guest, Noel Pearson, to speak on the importance of the voice referendum. Thank you, Noel.
Okay. Thank you very much. The decisive events of 1788 are kind of at issue here with this referendum. Because up to that point, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations of the country enjoyed their own laws and customs over their own traditional homelands. And then came the arrival of the First Fleet. And the First Fleet set up a colony. We now know that the assumption that the land was not owned by the Aboriginal people, we now know that under the law of England, that was wrong. Properly understood, the law of England recognised the title of the occupants, which we now call native title. So there was a failure of recognition when the First Fleet arrived. And the main idea behind that failure or denial was the idea of terra nullius, the assumption that the land was vacant and had no owners. And that assumption turned out, according to the law of Australia, to be wrong. And the native title decision of the High Court of Australia in June 1992 corrected the law and told us as Australians that native title existed in Australia and should have been respected. So those events in 1788 represented a denial of the existence of Indigenous people and their rights to their homelands. And 200 years of dispossession and a severe depopulation, to put it euphemistically. Severe depopulation of the Aboriginal people who lived in the continent at that time. Of course, I think everybody knows that in Tasmania, that depopulation was to the tune of 99% in 50 years. 99% of the original Tasmanian population was gone within 50 years. On the mainland, many tribes disappeared off the face of the earth. Demographers say there were probably around 1 million Indigenous people in Australia at the time of the arrival of the British. Pretty soon, that number was reduced to 150,000. Demographers also tell us, and archaeologists and anthropologists tell us, that probably 2.5 billion people, Indigenous people, lived in Australia in all of the hundreds and thousands of years that Aboriginal people lived on this continent. The question is, if the country failed, the new colony failed in 1788 to recognise the Indigenous peoples, what would the country do when the colonies federated and Australia was formed in 1901? When the colonies came together and formed a new constitution, they had a referendum. They actually had 3 referenda in 1898, 1900, and those referenda, there was a no campaign back then. Many Australians in the colonies did not want to join the country up into one nation. And in fact, it took 2 goes for Western Australia and Queensland to finally join and vote in favour of the formation of Australia. So the formation of Australia was never easy. There was a lot of opposition to it, and there was a no case. People were putting very strenuously the case against the creation of Australia. But that finally gave way to the Federation, and today we have this thing called Australia. But when that Australia was formed, this was another opportunity to deal with the question of the pre-existing people, the Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islanders. And again, the answer was no. Aboriginal people were excluded from the Constitution, and they were excluded from being counted in the census. And that situation lasted up until 1967. So the answer in 1901 was the same as the answer in 1788, which was no. Now, one would think perhaps that it was highly presumptuous of the colonists to turn up in a homeland populated by people who had been there for 60 millennia and say, we are not going to recognize you. And they do that twice. They do it when they first land and they proclaim sovereignty on behalf of the British Crown. And they do it again when they form a new independent nation called Australia. That would be highly presumptuous, and it was. Now, 120 years on, the same question is posed. Will Australia, a nation that has been in existence for 120 years, recognise the original peoples? Lots of people are contemplating saying no in the referendum. For Aboriginal people, this potential that Australians might say no to their outstretched hand, inviting reconciliation and recognition. For Indigenous people, that sometimes gives rise to anger. A lot of Indigenous people I know are outraged that people resist our recognition in our own country. Another emotion that is aroused is one of indignation. How could it be that there be resistance to recognition of the pre-existing peoples of the country. A kind of third reaction is incredulity. People are incredulous. They think, really? Are you serious? Are you really saying that the people original to the country will remain outside of its constitution, and we will resist, and we will be resisted from entering the Commonwealth via the constitution? Those are the range of reactions that I hear in my community. Anger, indignation, and incredulity. It is a strange thing that the original people of the country should be the ones seeking recognition from the newcomers. It is a strange order of business that Indigenous people should beseech the newcomers a measure of recognition. Surely, many of my people tell me, surely it should be the other way around. It should be we recognizing them. It's our country. We are native to this continent. It should be us recognizing and welcoming them to Australia, rather than us seeking their recognition of us. Those are the reactions that members of my community have. However, the fact is that the power structure of Australia lies with the non-Indigenous people who established new colonies in Australia and took over our homelands. We have to accept that the power structure lies with them. And that power structure is the Constitution. And this nation of Australia has been created in our traditional homelands. So we have to, as Shireen said, look to the Constitution to take a rightful place in the country. Now, some of our people are offended by that. And I understand their offence. My approach is that we are beseeching. We cannot but beseech the Australian people to do the thing that wasn't done in 1788, wasn't done in 1901, and to finally do in 2023 the one thing that will bring us from the margins of Australia and into the main frame of Australia through its constitution. The problem the problems we have as a people have in their core this disempowerment and alienation from the country. We've got to fix that. We've got to empower our people to take a rightful place in our own country. And we can't be aliens in our own land. I fear for the future of our people if we continue as we are. The status quo is not static. The status quo is a decline, is a continued decline. Socially, spiritually, culturally, economically, we're on a trajectory of decline. That's the decline we urgently need to turn around. We need to restore the dignity of our people. We need to heal our people. And part of that process is that we need new friendships with Australians. Too many of our people are dying deaths of despair, deaths of alienation, deaths of impoverishment and exclusion. Too many of our people's spirits are broken. Our country must once again become a healing place for our people rather than our mortuaries. So this referendum is our best opportunity to get it right finally. There's a lot of things we need to do right down at the lowest and fundamental level of the family and the family home. We've got to tackle poverty. We've got to tackle food. We've got to tackle family life and family relationships. We've got to rebuild strong culture, spirit in our people. But these things, these sufferings are not just personal. They're not just at the personal and family level. Our sufferings have connections to structure. There are structural reasons why our problems are so extreme and so bad. Nobody chooses to be alienated from their children. Nobody chooses to spend so much of their lives and so many of their people in jail. No people choose these things. No people choose for their young people to be in detention in such great numbers. There are forces of history and structure and relationships in this country that explain the crisis levels of despair and misery. we've got to tackle structural problems, as well as supporting people at the personal level. We've got to tackle some of the big structures in society. And the ultimate structure that Shireen talked about is the Constitution. We've got to get equality and power from the Constitution through recognition, through our ability to talk with government and the Parliament about the policies that affect our people. I believe this is our first best chance and our last best hope. This is such a fundamentally important referendum. If Australians don't understand how important this is, we will lose it. We've got to understand what is at stake here. We've got to have a bigger vision for the future. I want this referendum to recognise our people. In the words of the amendment, the actual amendment that we're going to vote on, it says, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia. Those are the words. As the first peoples of Australia. I think Australians can come at that. I think Australians reading those words will come at that if we get them to see past all of the fear, all of the scaremongering, all of the false debates, all of the diversions. If we get them to see those words in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia, I can't conceive any reason why that is an insuperable question for Australians. So I want to urge the Buddhist community in Australia to support us in this referendum. We need your support. We are 3% of the population. We need the 97% to come on board. It cannot be won by us. It can only be won by what the 97% do. And I'll finally say, before we go to questions and other speakers, I want to finally say our biggest challenge is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the most unloved community in this country. We are the least popular. There's more antipathy and strong feeling against us than any other group. And being such an extreme minority, it's very difficult to counteract that. It has always been like this. As much as we have had many improvements, the Australia in which my grandfather grew up and lived, and the Australia in which my father grew up and lived was so much harsher than the Australia I've grown up in. But in each generation, our people have been the lowest of the low in terms of the esteem in which we've been held by our fellow Australians. We're outcasts in our own land. People have strong, strong, strong feelings about us. And most of the people with those feelings have never met us. They've never had a meal in our homes. And we've never had a meal in their homes. These people who've never had us in their homes know everything about us and what's best for us, apparently. This has gone on for a long time. With the referendum, we'll put this behind us. Once we have recognition, we will put this behind us. And we'll give ourselves the next 20 years to have a meal in everybody's home. And the country will be better. So thank you very much to the association for this opportunity to speak with you. I'm going around the countryside. I've been down Tasmania, Devonport, Launceston, Ulverston, back up to Newcastle, spent 4 days with the Catholic diocese in Newcastle and Maitland, talked to workers, been up in North Sydney talking to Liberal voters and Teal voters, and out Western Sydney with Indian voters, and Campbelltown and Blacktown and Bondi Beach and Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Torres Strait, South Australia. Myself and others are going around the countryside beseeching Australians of goodwill to join our cause and to vote yes in the referendum. We have fought for so long for this moment to come about. This is, for me, 15 years later. But it's 100 years later when I count our elders of the past who campaigned in a much harder Australia than the one I'm campaigning in. So I want to thank the association for your kindness. I found the Buddhist essay in the collection that Shireen edited for publication, the most warm and most, I gained the most succor from it. I want to thank you for that contribution, because it spoke to me in a way that I felt I so benefited from hearing it. So I'm open to any questions later after our speakers are finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noel. And there's a number of, I'll just read a couple of the responses in the chat here that are, of course, very much admiring and loving your contributions. Thank you so much, Noel, for making time and speaking so strongly. We will put this history behind us and have so much to learn from your mob and your ancient wisdom. I'm with you, brother. Thank you so much for outlining for us the extent, the depth, and the longevity of the intergenerational trauma for the First Nations peoples of this country. Bhante Sujato, I now invite you to give, from a Buddhist perspective, a response to the conversation, if you can. It's quite a very wide-ranging topic, but if you could encapsulate a few Buddhist principles that resonate with what we've heard so far.
Thank you so much, Venerable, and yeah, thanks, Noel. And particularly thanks for liking the chapter that I wrote. When I heard that you liked it, I've got like I had literal tears in my eyes from hearing that. So that meant a lot to me. Grew up in Australia as a white Australian, and I don't know. There's always a kind of feeling to me like there's some kind of missing or broken in who we are as a people. The first word I learned from local Noongar kids when I was just a kid growing up in the suburbs of Perth. Not a lot of Noongar kids around, but the first word I learned from them was lation. Oh yeah, going to go to the lations. What lation? Oh, relations. Oh, lation. Oh yeah, lation. And it told me something, like how important that is, that feeling of that connection and that community. And to me, I feel that the building of these connections and these communities is what this is all about. When I was first invited to come and sign on behalf of the ASA at Barangaroo in support of the Uluru Statement, the thing that really struck me about that event was that, as Noel said, there's like this hand which has been reached out to us and inviting us to step forward and do something meaningful and beautiful and good together. How often do we get this chance in the realm of, you know, law and politics and all of these kinds of things? How often do we get a chance to actually make that generational step better? Something that's not going to be just turned over or undone the next year or the next after, but will become part of who we are. These things are deeply meaningful and they reflect our sense of our belonging and who we are. And so to me, it felt like such an incredible opportunity. And the fact that it's a referendum makes it even better, because a referendum is an invitation to every single citizen of Australia to lend their support. And that heartbreaking expression by Noel that the Aboriginal people are so unloved, this is a chance for us to show a demonstration of love, a chance that is not going to come again, like not anytime soon. It's a step forward that we can make. Constitutions matter. Buddhists should know this because of, well, Constitution of India for a start, written by Dr. Ambedkar, and it pushes back against the idea of the caste system in India, makes it illegal effectively. Sometime later, Dr. Ambedkar converted to Buddhism along with 1 million of the Dalit outcast community in India. Now, what does it mean to convert, to become a Buddhist? Well, what it meant to those people was that for the first time ever, they were told, yes, you can. You can get an education. Yep. You can get a job. You can get a better place to live. And it's amazing what happens if you give people a go. I met one of these convert Buddhists, we call Ambedkar Buddhists, a student of my dear friend Ayeshe. She's just this girl, she's like 16 years old. She's come from Maharashtra. I still remember that meeting, you know, she just grew up in the worst situation in the slums, just one tin shed, abusive father, alcohol, everything, just all the things you could possibly imagine. And just talking to her, what does she want to do? All she wants to do is to get enough grades to go to university and become a social worker so that she can help people like her. That's it. That's all she wanted. She just wanted the chance to do that. And so these people who've been lifted up like this, in this way, it worked. How do I know it worked? Because they're my neighbours and friends here in Harris Park, and they're in Australia with jobs in IT now. And they've gone from being the lowest of the low in India to now having a good life. Why? Because somebody believed in them, because somebody loved them, because somebody cared for them, because somebody finally said, yes, you can. And so this, to me, is part of what we're doing here, not as a sort of a great gesture on our behalf. Like, we don't have to give up anything. We're not asked to sacrifice anything. We're merely asked to respond to that helping hand and to give each citizen of Australia the chance to step forward and say, yes, let's become fuller and better as human beings. Let's become part of a country that we can be proud of. Let's become part of something which will be recognized as being a generational shift in perceptions and beliefs and values and in the lives of people who really need it. We have the chance to be able to become part of that. So there's something that the Buddha said, which I always try to remember. He said he doesn't praise falling back in good things. He doesn't even praise standing still, but he only praises moving forward. So we have a chance to move forward, not a chance to just sort of slug it out in the trenches and argue for this bit or that bit or something like that. You know, the usual day-to-day business of politics and bureaucracy and administration. I mean, that goes on, right? That's going to go on anyway. But we have a chance to do something that's going to lift above that and to send a message that is clear and pure and inspiring to all Australians. Yes, we want to give that voice. Yes, we want to recognise the custodianship of Aboriginal people in Australia and First Nations people. And yes, we want to become fuller and better and more as Australians and as citizens and as human beings. A couple of years ago, I had the chance to meet an Aboriginal elder, Noel Nannup, in Perth. And as it happened, Noel Nannup came from the same town, Geraldton, as my family. And I said to him, oh, you might remember my father, Ned Pinder. He said, oh, yeah, you look like him. And we sat down with Noel, and the first thing that Noel said, without any prompting, was, you know, he said the essence of the way that Aboriginal people see the world is as impermanence. And I was really struck by this because obviously this is a fundamental Buddhist principle as well. And I didn't ask him, I wasn't looking for points of connection, but he said when we see nature, we see change. We see where is the water flowing now? What direction is the wind blowing? What birds are calling in the trees and what song are they singing? And these things, the sounds around and the changes of nature, this is how we learn. It's impermanence. Our nation of Australia also is impermanent. Hasn't existed for very long. As Noel mentioned, it was a struggle to put together. Might have ended up very differently. But we're here. And we are every day part of Australia, part of what this country is. So that's going to change. That's always going to change. And so our question is, are we going to make that change in a positive direction, or are we just going to let the chance slide? So for me, I'm deeply honoured to be part of this movement and part of this change. And for me, it's one of the most meaningful things that I've been able to do as an Australian. I should probably finish up about there. I don't want to talk for too long, but Venerable Choggi, maybe we have time for some questions or something like that.
Yes, thanks, Bhante Sujato. Thanks for that. Really bringing together a Buddhist perspective and our support for Indigenous Australia. As Noel said, you know, the 3% of the population that is the most unloved, which is quite ironic because I think they're most knowledgeable in the whole of the country. Like, are we crazy? Sorry, just a personal view. So yeah, we do have some questions coming up from our Buddhist community. So we'll start with those, and then another series of questions has come up in the chat as well in relation to dealing with people who are confused or counteracting the messages from the No campaign without telling people how to vote. So, of course, we want to be able to get to that because we face that daily. So firstly, how would our Aboriginal brothers and sisters want the Buddhist community to advocate and lobby for the yes vote while maintaining maximum respect and gratitude to First Nations people? So I should have said at the beginning that maybe Noel or Shireen can kick off the responses. Perhaps Noel, we could get a response.
I was going to flick to Shireen.
Okay, flick to Shireen.
It's something I grapple with as a non-Indigenous advocate for this, right? But I mean, I take my lead from Noel and other Indigenous leaders, but from the Uluru Statement. I mean, the Uluru Statement was in a massive majority consensus of Indigenous people inviting us as non-Indigenous people to walk with them, to advocate with them. And I just kind of think, you know, we need to step up now. You know, as Noel said, they can't do this by themselves. They're only 3% of the population. We need to, if we think this is a fair request and a just request, we need to stop equivocating and, you know, yes, of course, be respectful to all different views, but be careful that in being respectful to, you know, if we believe the polls, under 20% of Indigenous dissenters now. If you're too respectful to them, then you end up disrespecting the very hard work that the majority of Indigenous advocates have done to propose this. So I think the Indigenous invitation, the majority Indigenous consensus does deserve to be respected. And I think as non-Indigenous Australians, we've got to be out there. You know, I often say when I speak to multicultural audiences, this is our constitution too. You know, the constitution belongs to all Australians. And as Bhante Sujato said, this is about all of us. It's an invitation to every single one of us. So we need to, each of us, make this moral decision, yes or no. Are we going to say yes to the invitation from Indigenous people to finally recognise them in the constitution from which they're excluded by giving them an advisory voice in their affairs? Or are we going to say no, that we want things to stay the same? Or as Noel said, we want things to continue going backwards, you know, because the gap is actually, on some indicators, it's widening, right? We are going backwards. So we need to decide yes or no. And I think each of us needs to decide that. And if it's a yes, I would just urge us, do not be passive bystanders. You know, we should be optimistic, but we cannot be complacent here. This will only get over the line if every single one of us who wants this to succeed is out there actively, actively be creative. What can you do to help persuade undecided people, to help dispel myths, dispel misinformation? You know, this has to be a joint effort. This has to be a joint effort or we won't get there. So I would just say to you so strongly, don't be too respectful of the Indigenous dissenters, lest you risk being disrespectful to the majority of Indigenous people who are asking us to step up here. This is our one chance. And as a descendant of Indigenous Indian migrants to this country, this could be our only chance to give back to Indigenous people, you know, to give back to them for everything that they've gone through, and that we as migrants and descendants of migrants have gained so much in a way from their losses. This might be our only chance to truly give back. So let's do everything we can.
Great, thanks, Shireen. Noel, this is definitely one for you. Can you say more about the three themes mentioned in your invitation to the Buddhist community? So you mentioned the three parts that make up Australia: the ancient Indigenous heritage, I think we've talked about that, the British institutions built upon that foundation, and the adorning gift of multicultural migration. And what is the interaction between the three of these?
I think the main ideas in Australia is the settler native idea. So when the colonists came from the United Kingdom, they set up this concept of the settler, and the settler's counterpart was the native, us. And the natives could be relegated to the margins and perhaps discriminated against and excluded. They may be given native homelands later in the colonial history. But this kind of settler idea is a universal idea of colonialism. The settlers set up, they take over the country, and the natives get pushed to the margins. So what about the migrants that follow the original settlers? Where do they fit in? We've had Chinese in Australia since the mid-19th century in the goldfields. I remember the former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, in the 1980s, somewhat patronizingly referring to how the late Victor Chang, this surgeon, was, a prime example of a new immigrant who was contributing so powerfully to his adopted country. Well, no, Victor Chang's great-grandparents came out to Australia much long ago than many Australians, white Australians. So we don't know where to fit the migrants. They remain as a perpetual third citizen or something behind the Europeans, and behind certainly the descendants of the settlers. That's the kind of Australia I think we have today. There's the kind of first settlers, and then there's this multicultural migrant group that, do we count them as settlers? Where do they fit? You've got the settlers and the natives. What do you do with the migrants? My idea is that we must move forward. We must move beyond the settler native and see Australia for what it is, having those three parts, three stories: the Indigenous story, the British story centred on our Constitution, actually. Our Constitution is really the embodiment of the British story: the democracy, the parliament, the rule of law, the English language. All of those things centre on the Constitution. So that's the second part of our story. And then the third part is this thing staring us in the face, which actually the Indigenous people and the Britons are part of too, which is multicultural unity. Those, I think, are the three stories of Australia. And I'd like our young children to grow up with that idea of Australia, rather than the settler native idea. And where do you fit the migrants? Where do you fit the multicultural groups? So I think those three stories of Australia can be brought together if we move forward to it. If we move forward with this referendum, we will put the third piece of the jigsaw into place for a new idea about Australia, centred on this long Indigenous heritage, these British institutions, and this, the blessing of multicultural unity. And I think that that's the opportunity that we're facing. This referendum won't be just about the Indigenous part. When you put the third piece of the jigsaw together, it makes a whole. We won't be celebrating just that third piece. We'll be celebrating the achievement of the whole. And I think it'll be a very great thing for all of us. It's important for all of us, because I want to move to an Australia where particularly our non-European migrants are understood without any hesitation to be Australian. They're not kind of provisional Australians or, subject to good behaviour Australians. They're Australians. I really am disturbed when newspapers talk about African youth. No, they're Australian youth. They're our youth. And I hope that with recognition, and we complete the Constitution, and we bring the Indigenous people into the Constitution and the Commonwealth and the country, and one of the flow-on effects of doing that will be that we come to understand that, none of the multicultural groups are kind of provisional Australians. They're Australians. And they bring a lot of blessings to the rest of us. And I really believe that we bring those three stories together, we'll be a much better country.
Thanks so much, Noel. So perhaps Shireen can start with responding to the next one from putting your legal hat on. Why didn't the process start with treaty first, as stated in the Uluru Statement of the Heart, then truth-telling, expressing whatever feelings, guilt, etc., and then follow with the voice?
The logical way for it to proceed, and the architects of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including Noel, Megan Davis, Pat Anderson and others, have been very clear that the right way to proceed is for the voice to come first. So I disagree that the Uluru Statement said that treaty needs to come first. That's not my understanding of the Uluru Statement at all. In fact, the opposite. And to me, it makes perfect sense that a voice should be there. I think, there used to be this debate in Australia that are you in the treaty camp or you're in the constitutional recognition camp? And that was a false dichotomy. And an important thing that the Uluru Statement did was explode that false dichotomy, right? It said we want a voice and we want a Makarrata Commission to be set up in legislation. Now, if you look at what's happened in Victoria, they've got a treaty process underway there. But the first thing they had to do before agreement making could get underway was set up a First Nations voice for Victoria, because the practical reality is that Indigenous communities need a representative body to deal with government, to negotiate things and eventually to sign agreements. So I think they're separate questions. And it makes sense to me, practical, logical sense, that you need to get something anchored into the Constitution first. I also think there's a misconception out there amongst progressives on the far left that a treaty is somehow better and stronger, that somehow it's a better thing, you get more. A treaty is just a political agreement. It's an agreement. It's subject to negotiation. It totally depends what's in the treaty, what's agreed, and that's the big question mark. Now, if you look around the world at similar Western democracies that do have a history of treaty making, treaties were not silver bullets because they were simply political agreements, and quite often the more powerful crown, because that top-down power relationship is still in play, the more powerful government, the colonising crown, would breach their treaty promises, right? So we saw that in New Zealand with the Treaty of Waitangi, and you see that in Canada. Treaties are not a silver bullet. They are political agreements. What's in them is up to subject negotiation. Having a constitutionally guaranteed voice, even though it's advisory, that's something that can't be taken away. That's an important thing. So I completely understand why Indigenous people would want that to come first. By the same token, I also don't understand why some right-wing commentators try to fearmonger about treaties. They're agreements. If governments don't want to sign up to the agreement, they won't sign. If governments don't want all, my land, give up land and all these scary things that the fearmongers want to say, why would a government sign up to these scary things in a future agreement? If the Australian people don't want a treaty, there won't be treaties. And if the governments don't want treaties, there won't be treaties, because it takes two to sign any agreement, right? Or three in our federation.
Thanks, that's really, really clear. We need that message more. So the next question is, how would the Voice to Parliament handle discrimination of minorities such as LGBTQIA+ and responses to climate change? And I should say as well, there's there's concern here in the chat about, I don't know if it goes along with this part, but give it a go, that a sense of the voice covers all areas of executive government, so no issue is beyond reach. So perhaps the first part first, or it could be just one real concern generated here. So who'd like to start?
For the first part.
Oh, Ro, yeah. Okay, thanks, Noel.
I just want to deal with that second issue of the executive power and representation to the executive. We've got a card that you can find on the Yes23 website, or Shireen, where do we have this? Yes. Okay, thank you. Who's put that up?
That's Shireen.
That was me.
Okay. This is the actual words of the alteration that will be made to the constitutional the Australian people are being asked to authorise. And so you got that line that I referred to earlier, in recognition as the First Peoples of Australia. So that's the recognition clause. Then there's the guarantee clause, there shall be a body. That's the constitutional guarantee or the promise that there shall be a body. The third thing is that this body may make representations to the Parliament and executive government. But look at the last line in that clause. On matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's very plain in the wording of the referendum, the clause that we're considering at the referendum, very plain that advice will be made or representations will be made on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So all of that public talk about, oh, they'll be advising on this and they'll be advising on nuclear submarines and other things like that. You've got to read the provision. It says matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the detail is answered in the last clause. The Parliament shall have power to make laws with respect to the voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. That's where the detail is.
Yeah.
Need to understand clause 3 there, because it says who's responsible for the detail? The Parliament. It's not the government. It's not Aboriginal leaders. It's not anybody outside of Parliament. It's the Parliament that has the power to make laws. And those 4 words at the end, composition, functions, powers, and procedures, that covers everything to do with the voice. So the Parliament has the full power to provide the details on the voice. And a lot of debate has gone on about, oh, you know, where's the detail? Who's going to, who's hiding the detail? And the honest truth is that if you read clause 3, you can see very clearly that it's the Parliament that will have the, and this is always the case. Under our constitutional system, it's always the Constitution that authorises the Parliament to make laws. And they'll make laws about the voice, same as they make laws about the ABC. They make laws about the High Court. They make laws about everything. It's the Parliament that makes the laws. And it'll be the same thing with the voice. It'll be the Parliament that does that. So in conversations with friends and colleagues and family and with fellow Australians, I really urge that you use a business card like this that has the provision on one side, which is on the screen, and then the next screen, Shireen, has a breakdown of the 4 parts of the amendment: the recognition part, the guarantee part, the purpose part, and the detail part. And I'm finding in having conversations around the countryside that this is the best way of focusing the minds of people. What is this about? What is the voice? What's this amendment? And I just say, well, actually, it's about us changing the Constitution and adding these words to the Constitution. And this is what these words mean.
That's great. We can all download that from yes23.org. Have a few to hand out to your friends and family, everyone else. So we're coming towards the end. Just one final one about what consequences to be aware of should the yes vote not be successful. I know in your presentation, Noel, you presented pretty, sort of shattering scenario for, well, if we don't move forward. But is that the only option? What to be aware of should the yes vote not be successful? No. Yeah, please.
What will happen if the vote fails?
Yes, if the vote fails, yeah.
Well, I'm certainly not contemplating that.
Good.
I just think it's too dreadful a prospect to contemplate. This really is a great chance we've got, and our best chance. There's no need to be despondent. The chance we have here is we are so close.
Yeah. We
are now so close to achieving something that people have been striving for a very long time. I just don't want to bend to pessimism or negativity about our chances. Of course, we are realistic about where we're at. And I'm telling you, we are in a good position. We are in a good position. But we've got to appeal to the better angels of the Australian nature. We're going to take the fear out of this proposition, and we do that, I think, by keeping faith with the Australian people. There's no use being pessimistic about Australians. I think if you want people to rise to their best self, to show their best self, it is best to be optimistic and hopeful and encouraging of them rather than being negative.
That's a very positive note. We like positive. It keeps us going forward. And we're coming towards the end of this session, and I'd really like to thank you, Noel and Shireen in particular, for giving us so much background. There were a few more questions, or if anyone else has any questions, you can write to us, asasecretary@gmail.com. So ASA for Australian Sangha Association, ASA Secretary, one word, @gmail.com, and we'll try and get those answered. Also, we had questions about what other activities are coming up that people can get involved with. I think some conversations are happening around a request to the BSWA, Ajahn Brahm, to have an event there. And Gawain's put in the event for the forum in Sydney on the 2nd of September. Also, as Noel mentioned, we can all get those cards from the Yes campaign, yes23.org. We can go to Together Yes, hold a kitchen table discussion, have a discussion in our temples and in our institutes and so forth, in our Buddhist centres, and just keep the conversation alive. We've got a lot of material from tonight that can keep us going. And so already in the chat, if you take note, there's a whole lot of information booklets, and there were resources that were that are hot linked from the beginning of tonight. So thank you all very much. And I'd invite Bhante Sujato to send us off with a chant to close these proceedings.
Sadhu, sadhu. Thanks so much, Venerable. And thanks so much, Noel and Shireen, and to everyone from the ASA for helping to put this together. It's been fantastic. I'll just recite now a few verses, the Buddha's chant, auspicious chant of victory, which essentially says that just as the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and realized his aim of awakening, evang tawang vijaya hohi, may you too also achieve victory. And so this is for Noel, for all of those who worked so hard on the voice, and for all of us in Australia who really, whatever our divergences, whatever our different backgrounds, whatever our different opinions and views, at the end of the day, we all want everyone to be happy. We want people to be freed from suffering. That's the purpose of the Buddha's teachings and the purpose of our life. So let's make sure that when we are engaging with this, we engage it in a positive way. And if we have differences, then let us respect each other's differences and make sure that we treat each other with the respect that we deserve. Jayanto bodhiya mule sakyanang nandivardhanu evang tavang vidaya ohidaya sujaya mangale aparadita palanke chise patavipo kare abhiseke samabudhana kagapato isunakatan sumangalang supapatan
Supapatan
Sumoto
Suhupitang
Isam
Suhoto
Brahmachari
Brahmachari
Kamang Vajrakamang
Amang
Dakinam
Badakinan
Dakin
Manokamang Panidite
Panidite
Padakina
Badakina
Padakinani
Padakinani
Kapitwana
Kapatwana Labang
Labante
Bante
Padakine
Badakine.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. We all got there in the end.
Next up. Thank you very much. Very auspicious ending. And again, thank you for everyone who participated as well. As it says in the chat, everyone's been very enriched by the information shared tonight. So thank you.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Cheers, Noel.
Yeah.
Cheers.